All right, welcome everybody. Yeah, I think everyone here has been here for at least one of these program committee meetings, so welcome back, everybody. We're a smaller group tonight. I know we're missing Judith and Jen Watley, but we'll share this afterward. So yeah, we'll just go ahead and dive right in because we have some new topics to discuss tonight and also to expectation set. I'm just going to say at the top that we have some new ideas to talk about tonight. We also have the upcoming Juneteenth event and things like that just to remind about, but we try to keep these meetings to an hour. So I'll just name that at the top so that we can use our time wisely. So I guess I'll just turn it over to Kelly to start
Yeah,
sharing with us about some of the new opportunities and possibilities for programming and the needs that are there.
absolutely. So the first thing I wanted to talk about this evening is a proposal that we just submitted. We should actually find out really soon, potentially as early as this week or next week, about it. And if we do get awarded, it needs to come to the full board for vote because it deviates from our existing budget. So I wanted to sort of give the program committee sort of a preview to that in case we do have to call a meeting to it, and just sort of some of the ideas and things that we have been exploring. So I think I don't know if folks are aware, but there is a lot of settlement money that's pouring into communities across the country around opioid abatement. And that has come out of some of the big national lawsuits with the folks who created the opioid crisis. So the first tranche of funding in DC has proposals that have just been opened, and GMC applied to expand, both enhance and expand some of our existing programs, particularly taking place at the pop-up because the pop-up location has, excuse me, more space for us to do programming. When we first got on, I was talking about some of the opioid prevention programming that we've had. We've done opioid prevention work now for 4 years through a small grant. Like tomorrow we have this painting class and some different things that we've been doing on that front. The opioid proposal that GMC submitted is technically for the remaining 4 months of the fiscal year. But if we are granted the money, it would then roll over into next year as well. And so for that year and a quarter accounts for about $800,000 based on the budget that we submitted. About $50,000 of the, $50,000 of the initial 200 that we asked for covers existing costs that we have already. And then the remaining balance would be to expand some opioid treatment programming. We would be adding recovery groups to be operated at a GMC, which our staff and guests have identified as something that they want us to expand programming in. We would be doing what is called a contingency reward program. And so what it does is it gives financial incentives for individuals for abstinence. And there's different studies out there that show the effectiveness of this over a period of time. So a big chunk of the money that we applied for includes those financial incentives that would go directly to our guests, participants in the program. And then there's also expanding a component of what's the word I'm looking for? Skills training, and exploring opportunities to add some social enterprise aspects to things that we would start to pilot at the pop-up and do some proof of concept pieces with that would then we could potentially expand in the future if that proof of concept goes well. So the grant, if awarded, would cover all of the expended, like both the new expenditures, which would include adding additional staff and expanding out our clinical staff, as well as covering existing costs that we have for the program. And so questions about that. It was sort of a fast, like the turnaround time on the grant proposal was really short. So we had to pull together something really quickly. But I think it could both it creates additional programming that our guests need and want, as well as support some of our existing expenditures, and then helps us expand the programs into areas that we have been interested in expanding. So questions?
When you say the clients want it, is this just anecdotal evidence, or kind of what kind of demand, what do you base it on? A little more background?
Yeah, so for that, it's both anecdotal, but also we do annual surveys to our guests to ask them basically what are we doing well, where can we improve, and what are we not offering that you currently would like to see. And there's some other things that are embedded in that, but that is what we base that on, or like that's where we get that demand specifically as well. Rebecca, would you add anything else to that? No. Okay, cool.
And you gave me a heads up on a little bit of this because it would involve like some possibly additional space or time usage at the pop-up location in our hall, right? So a lot of that is, and I said yes because we have that availability, and we'd be supportive of it here, and excited about it. So would a lot, like, this is going to sound like an odd question, would any of that expanded programming happen at the main center? Do you?
No, we don't anticipate that. It would all happen.
I mean, you're kind of maxed out at the main.
Well, that's the thing.
Right?
We don't really have space to do anything at the primary center. The intention would be to expand the hours. It would be actually that we would expand the days of the pop-up, because we would need those additional days for the abstinence testing and verification, and to provide the treatment meetings as well, recovery meetings.
So Kelly, can you just talk a little bit about like how the program works? So folks who want to participate, they would be tested, is it like monthly or weekly, or
they have to, so twice a week is what they would.
And what type of incentive are they getting?
Cash equivalencies.
Okay.
So gift cards.
Gift cards. Okay.
And so what's with this kind of intervention, it's progressive. So like the longer they abstain, the bigger the dollar amount is. Ooh. And so it like stacks up. And so we have sort of a different phase. There's phases of it. So there's the initial abstinence phase, like the treatment phase, and then you transition into a recovery phase where there is a lower level of incentive to basically maintain that abstinence. And so it's a fairly new, this kind of incentive is a fairly new concept, if you will. It's been used the most with stimulants, but it has been used with opioids as well. California is using it with their Medicaid, a statewide program. So it's not like obscure, this methodology, but it is not as widely used.
And then how many guests would you anticipate would participate, or is there like a target of?
So we would enroll, so our intention is to enroll 30 folks who, and so there are various surveys that we would do, and qualifying, there's a special assessment that folks would have to do to qualify their risk, and they would get dropped into one of two buckets: those with active substance use issues, and depending upon the score, there are different types of treatment recommendations that we would make for them, with a certain score being optimal for this type of program. And that we could host up to 30 people at a time in that program. Because there's a lot of research around the social connectedness of the spread of opioid use, we also plan to have a prevention program that also uses financial incentives, which is not something that has been done as widely, and sort of is our riff on an existing program to see what kind of outcomes that we can see through that with the prevention of folks. Because once certain drugs are in a population, they tend to spread. So there's a lot of like social connectedness around what drugs are socially acceptable and things like that. And so if we're trying to limit the spread of the use of opioids, then there is a separate financial incentive program where people would opt into doing the urinalysis testing to prove that they are not engaging in that, and that they were preventing the use of potential opioids when we know there's a high opioid use within our community already.
And is there like a target goal out of that 30? Would you like to get 20 or 15 or 25 or?
Yeah, I mean, I think, hold on, I can't remember off the top of my head what we put in our proposal, but I can tell you that. In terms of our outcomes, we expect 65% of folks to be able to maintain the abstinence. And that's based on baselines from other studies.
About how many staff do you figure you'll have to have?
So the staff we've added into, so we have covering of existing staff, which includes part of Rebecca's time, part of Taylor Bush's time, and our pop-up coordinator Ben's time. And then in addition to that, we would be adding 3 positions: a licensed clinical social worker, a substance abuse counselor, and a peer recovery specialist.
Thank you.
Sorry, I missed this. If I missed this because of technical difficulties, but how much is the incentive? In the the starting thing?
It changes over time, and so we have a so it starts. So there's different incentives depending upon whether they're in the active user or the prevention period, but the reward starts at $5 per test, and then it increases by $1 per test for each subsequent week for up to 24 weeks. And so the total, the maximum aggregate incentive that they can receive is $800. And so the relapse rate is at the highest in its first 6 months. And so that's why we have that 24-week period for the highest intensity of intervention. If they do submit an opioid positive sample, then they don't get the cash incentive, and then it resets back to the initial $5 a test, is how the systems work for contingency
And-
management.
But do they still max out of the program at 24 weeks, or do they go?
Yeah, so they would max out of that initial piece at 24 weeks, but then they can transition to the sustainability phase for the next 6 months. And then at that point they submit weekly samples and are eligible for up to $25 cash equivalent a month for that, I think, if I remember correctly. And their maximum aggregate for the second 6 months is $700. So for a year, the maximum possible benefit is $1,500 of cash equivalent.
And all covered by this grant, correct?
And it's all would be covered by this. Yes. So it's not any money out of it would all be covered by this.
I think it's a pretty good program.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I just happened to catch a NPR story yesterday or sometime over the weekend. It was talking about the data around studies with this incentivized financial program with alcohol abuse,
Yep.
And about how it was piloted in some cities on a small basis during the last Obama administration, and people were really not sure that it was going to work. Like nobody thought this was going to work, but that they were shocked at how people really did show up every morning. Like they thought either people aren't going to show up or they're not going to test clean, and they did. And as I was hearing this story, I was also thinking about, and I think from conversations with our guests and thinking about just the model of service agencies changing from providers to, frankly, allies, and a more justice-centered, like it puts I think giving people money can be something that people like, money is a sensitive topic for some people, but I think it puts trust back in the hands of people who are needing to rebuild their lives. And it's, for me, a justice thing about like, people need money to survive. It's really hard to be poor. It's really hard to rebuild. And this puts things realigned in the right hands. And so, yeah, we'll see if you get the grant, I guess.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we wouldn't do this without the money. So that would be the thing. So, and that's that.
And I'm sorry if you said already, when do you expect to hear?
As early as this week or next week. And so if we are awarded the funding, we would have to have a quick special meeting of the whole board to authorize because the budget deviation at that point is larger than what I'm allowed to do without board approval. Even though the money is there. So I'd have to come to the board, but since we're having this program committee and because it's a program initiative, wanted to preview it here to see, to have you guys ask questions, but also, kick the tires on it a little as well before if the opportunity arises that we bring it towards the whole board.
Good luck.
Yeah, hopefully, we'll see.
Yeah.
Other questions? All right, Rebecca, you want to talk about summer shelter?
Yeah, let's talk about summer shelter. Okay, so the summer shelter idea was sort of born out of the encampment clearings that have been happening in Ward 2. Basically, there's a shortage of shelter beds in the city. Shelter beds are full or almost like completely full every night. There are not enough beds for men and there are not enough beds for women. There are more people that want shelter than have access to shelter. And so when they do these encampment clearings, the number one question is, where do they go? And we say, we don't know, like to other encampments because there's no shelter beds available. So that the other thing that sort of led to this discussion is that we talk about winter shelter all the time, but we're a right to shelter city. So folks have access to shelter in the winter. In the summer, the capacity drops significantly. And sometimes the need is still there. And honestly, in the summer, I think like we have maybe more steady flow of people in the winter, but in the summer we're seeing new faces more. So like it sort of leads me to believe that there's even maybe more people that would access shelter. But our city does not necessarily provide beds for everyone that needs it. So um, we talk about winter shelter every year and whether or not that's something that we want to do. And I think ultimately decide that there is access to shelter across the city for all of our guests. And maybe that's not the best use of our resources and time. But then Kelly said, what about summer shelter with all of this, the capacity issues and with all of the encampment clearings? So the idea would be the same as a winter shelter, right? The partnering with congregations, sort of rotating based on capacity. The other things that are helpful to note is like a lot of our partners, maybe use their extra space for schools and stuff during the year. In summer, that's not as much of a barrier because usually schools are out in the summertime. And so what we've done sort of is, well, we had a conversation with Brett, and Brett has been doing a really good job of talking to a lot of different partners to sort of gauge interest and capacity and whether or not this is something that would be viable and whether or not this is something that would that other congregations would be excited about and want to support and have the right space and time and staff to support. I don't know, Brett, if you want to speak a little bit to that or if you want me to just keep going.
Yeah, I'll say that we have kind of I took kind of a census of at least the congregations. I've heard back from most of them in the neighborhood and who are part of our GMC. And some of them have different restrictions, don't have space right now, but many of them have said yes. Many of them are familiar with the winter shelter model in the past, and so we were able to discuss like some of the immediate questions were, would it be the same kind of situation? And if so, then we kind of have a sense of that. And so there's two aspects to that. There's providing space and providing meals. GMC would have to provide a staff person overnight, but that could be a possibility if it's greenlit and we feel like there's capacity in the neighborhood. There are several churches that have stepped up. I have a little chart that have said, yes, we could do it. Like, no, it's not easy. It's not like, yes, we'd always like more time to plan for something, but it is something that people understand a need and have responded to and have said yes to. Different congregations have different availability, but there's a patchwork which could provide at least a few weeks of shelter for the guests that need it. One of my questions to Rebecca and Kelly was, do we think we would have guests that would fill it? Because that was a challenge in the winter. And what you all shared with me was yes. And I think that also, given the current need in the city, that really does feel acute and different. And I think we are at a different place, frankly, with the staffing and the relationship with guests and how we're supporting them. So we would have guests that take up on this. I also want to share something else that came back in talking to the other pastors, clergy, rabbi, and congregations, was that in laying this out, kind of like Rebecca and Kelly just did, several of them came back to me and said, well, why don't we as a city have more shelter beds available? Why don't we have a right, like the winter shelter, right to shelter law in the summer? And can you let us know about advocacy efforts? And so I just want to name, and I want to share this just as Brett to the whole board, but also as hearing back from the congregations and as people of faith, I think we're got to think about this too, that like, I know we are a direct service agency and that direct service work is very important, but I think it's also important, and we're hearing from each other, that we want to be a part of the solution also upstream. And that means advocacy and thinking and talking to our city about making more resources available. And so that's a separate piece, but I just want to share that as I said to these congregations, like, hey, could we do this? What's your capacity? Let's be realistic about that. They said, I think, a really faithful yes or no, either way. But then they also said, hey, can we also be partners about working on the things upstream from this? So.
No,
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Sorry, go ahead, John.
no, you go ahead, Rebecca.
I was just gonna say, we were talking about that today too, like the visibility of homelessness, and so many times we get notified about people that like our system can't really, we've done all that we can to support them. I think the bid especially maybe feels that. And I know that we have conversations with that about that sometimes from time to time. And I think that the biggest thing is that like we've sort of done all we can do with the limits that the city is willing to like fund and support. And so I think that the advocacy thing is huge. And I think that the board is well positioned to like really be more involved there and like and lead you know, maybe their congregations in some of those advocacy efforts and share information that's pertinent.
No, I 100% agree. I think it's an opportunity for us to also re-engage our congregations, to kind of remind what GMC is doing, what role we play, how we help our guests, but then also as an organization, we can be, I think, a leader in that space of helping put the messaging together, provide the information so that our congregations, organizations like the BID or any university can go out and speak with a much larger voice than just, you know, the GMC staff, but we can help provide the context, the information, the right resources to help the message get to the right people. So yeah, I think this is an interesting. Kelly and Rebecca, what do you anticipate the budget number might be for this?
I anticipate it'll be similar. It depends on, well, so it depends on when we start the program, honestly. I anticipate that it'd be similar to the budget number that we put out there for the winter shelter. At this point, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brett, I'm not sure we have enough weeks covered with potential hosts yet. So it depends, like, do we want to do it for the amount of time that we have commitments for? There's a couple of different things that we would have to evaluate before. It's sort of like we're building the plane and flying it at the same time, because summer is here. It is already summer. And I literally had a conversation with one of our guests today who was in shelter, and she was late in getting back to the shelter 3 days ago and lost her spot. And now she's out on the streets and can't get in anywhere because she had her spot and she lost her spot, and now there's no place for her. And so we were helping walk through what that actually means for her. So I mean, there's need for sure, but yeah, I think so Brett's has put in the chat, we have 7 to 8 weeks of yeses, and potentially more. So I don't know if for us, if we want to like load it like the 7 to 8 weeks prior to hypothermia shelter would be one option, or like until hypothermia season opens, because I'd hate to like shelter folks and then unshelter, you know, there's like a bit of instability there. But I think as we look at that, I think there's some just different opportunities on how we could approach that.
I have I had 2 questions. One, how long do you think it would take to stand up a program?
I really appreciate your
Yeah.
analogy of building the plane while you're trying to fly it, but
Yeah,
like
yeah, no,
in
no,
this sub-8
absolutely.
how much of the 7-8 weeks will be reduced because of standing up a program like that. And
Mhm.
second, and Brett, maybe you might have a better sense of this. Do you think this ask might lead to like a zero-sum approach by any of the churches saying like, oh, we did it during summer, I don't think we have the capacity to extend it in the winter hypothermia season?
Mhm. Standing it up, we could stand it up fairly quickly, I think, Ray, like with like a couple of weeks notice if we had the appropriate space and funding for it.
Because Kelly, would you be looking at least initially to involve some existing staff members that
Yes.
are trusted for the
Absolutely.
overnight piece, and you'd be giving them extra hours,
Exactly.
and so it wouldn't be bringing on a new staff person. You'd be using someone trusted.
Mhm.
We think we have the cots, right?
We
So
do. Well, John has the cots. John, you still have the cots,
John
right?
has the
We have some
cots.
cuts, yes.
And
I think.
so, yeah. I have not talked to them about the possibility of winter. I think I did get questions from 1 or 2 congregations saying, well, if we say yes to this, is there also going to be an ask for winter? Because we just want to be realistic about the capacity of that. So I think we want to be thinking about that and communicate. Kelly and Rebecca, I think my question is that, and it's a process question, I think that's what we're doing here, but is like, so we've kind of, y'all, this is an idea stage. We've done some initial data gathering. Now, am I correct that now you're bringing this to the program committee and possibly the board, because we would need approval in order to like do any further planning, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we would need approval from the board to move forward on this. So this is sort of still step 1 of planning in that we've done that initial information gathering. Now sharing this with the program committee to get your feedback both on the concept, but also like understanding the limitations and sort of contingencies around that before we present it to the board. Once we have like enough there, then we can present it to the board. But I mean, at this point, we still don't have enough, in my opinion, but maybe you guys think we do have enough. That would be the question as well.
I also think it's helpful. I think, Brett, you said this, that some of the congregations were saying that they had concerns about whether or not they had the volunteer support during the summer months because so many people are traveling and have other things going on in summer months. And also it's pretty quick to, I think, turn around. Like people's calendars are already pretty set for the summer in a lot of cases. So that's something to note as well.
I think because my question has just been about summer, I think also the landscape's going to change if we're looking into like, because when does hypothermia start? November?
November.
Right. So if we're talking September, October, there are going to be a couple of congregations that can't offer space during the school year, but there are going to be other ones that can. And so like, it's going to be this shifting landscape, and some have, as I've noted, can offer space, but can't offer meals. So yeah. Rick, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, please. Christopher, did you talk to GPC? I'm just curious. Did we say yes or no? Or can you send me a text if you don't want to say? Or
oh, I'm happy to say. GPC said they could do a week in July, that they have very specific schedule commitments, and that GPC is committed on all the things you all faithfully do with the suppers and other efforts. But that their initial thought from the pastors was that they could do a week in July.
okay. And are you thinking like 10 guests, just like before? I heard John talk about that, so I think 10 was our capacity, pretty close to it.
Yeah, I think historically we've done like 10 to 12 is the capacity. And that would be our intended capacity this time as go around as well. It'd be similar to, it's hard for me to say exactly because I never saw a winter shelter because winter shelter didn't exist by the time I got here. So I can't faithfully say that it's going to look exactly the same, but I ran a winter shelter through Carpenter Shelter, which has a similar model. And so I'm going to make some assumptions that it's similar, and that's what it would look like.
Gotcha.
So Rebecca and Kelly, like, how many weeks would you think we need to aim for to make this kind of worth it, or something we really should get to?
I think it depends, right? Like it depends on what the capacity is. As I said, the one thing I think I'd be really cognizant of is that we want to be careful to set our guests up for success. And so we wouldn't want to do like July and August, and then they would be outside for September and October before they have an opportunity to go back inside again. Like that would feel not good in my mind. And so
Yeah, I think you're right. Like we would have to talk about all these things, and because we're like sort of in the idea like could this even happen stage, we haven't
Mhm.
necessarily talked about all of the like scenarios of how this plays out, both like when we're done and what that looks like. I also think it's like sort of dependent on like the city and what their capacity is going to do. Like, are they going to respond to the shortage of shelter capacity as well? I mean, they're still talking about the Aston, the non-congregate shelter in Foggy Bottom, if that's opening, and potentially a transition plan that could change how we view like what's important and when we can do that, I think. So just making sure that there are like thoughtful sort of transition plans, because like the person that, was so anxious today about losing her shelter bed, I think like we would just cause her a lot of harm by offering
Yeah.
shelter in a really short limit. It would break her trust with us in a lot of ways, I think,
Mhm.
in the daytime services that she receives from us. So we'd have to be really thoughtful about that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I think from the thing you laid out, where the need is clearly here, because of the lack of available shelters in the summertime, and what's going on with the encampments and the lack of resources, I think the need is there. I think to Rebecca's point, just because the need is there, it's got to make it work for us and for our guests. And so I would sort of, I hate to leave Rebecca and Kelly to say, tell us what the threshold is, or come up with
Mhm.
something. And if you guys think we can put something together that really helps our guests, which is what, all of our programs should be, then I think it's something we take to the board and say, hey, we think we've got it, not 100% figured out, but enough that the staff is comfortable to think that this is a worthwhile venture.
The other way we could consider it, and this is something we always discuss winter shelter, obviously through budgeting season, and I'm in that process right now for budgeting for next fiscal year. It could be something that we consider because the impetus for all of this is unlikely to change within the next calendar year. Because in fact, like funding is getting slashed across the board on everything. So everything that feels really bad right now is about to feel 10 zillion times worse on a lot of fronts in homeless services. So this might be, given the short turnaround time and the resource needs with this, it might be something that we want to talk about for next year instead. I mean, I know we're looking at this like sort of last minute because there is an immediate need that we're trying to respond to, but it might be something that we want to build into our plan for next year as well. I know that, and we've talked about this before, how important the shelter aspect has been with congregational engagement and different things like that. And so the capacity might be different with longer planning in place, so that we could evaluate it for when the shelters decommission in the middle of April next year, that's where we potentially pick up next year, because it is unlikely that shelter capacity with the number of beds that are going offline for renovations and other things, that the need will be there next summer as well.
Yeah, hearing all this, I agree with John and Rebecca and what everyone's been saying, that it seems clear that this idea is worth exploring. like
Mhm.
with what the landscape looks like, with the interest from congregations that Brett was able to like get initial feelings on. It seems like there's a match with potential resources with the need, and so that's worth moving forward to make sure that we do it right. Perhaps a way forward is for the staff to identify what's the starting point in the furthest future that we want to try offer something, and then work backwards from there to see like, so that way we can like build something that's reliable. And then if we can start, you said April, I'm just picking that way, if we could start April 2025 and we just get so much interest that backs all the way to July of this year, great. That's like, exciting. But then we just make sure we have that stability, since that seems to be an important aspect of doing this right.
Absolutely.
There can be more encampment clearings, right?
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that we've heard, yeah.
Yeah, so
End of this month.
yeah, June 24th, the canal and all the encampments along the river are also getting cleared. Basically, anything on National Park Service land is getting cleared, which is pretty much all parks land in the Georgetown area. So that means the encampments are being cleared. And this is something that folks get confused with a lot. So of folks who sleep outside, only 20% are in encampments. And so encampments are like those tents, like basically they've set up a tent. That's what it constitutes an encampment. Most people sleep rough, where they're sleeping in doorways or under bridges, like with just a sleeping bag or something. So, or just sleeping outside, like with nothing. So that is unsheltered, like totally. And that is different than an encamp. I mean, well, that's the encampments are part of that, but I just want to share that because that's something that's a misconception that folks often have when I talk to them about this issue. So all of those unsheltered folks are going to remain, are likely to remain unsheltered, and they are going to just, instead of sleeping outside in a tent, they will be just sleeping outside without a tent.
And more people die in from hyperthermia, right?
Yes,
In this
and
season than
hypo.
hypothermia, yes.
Mhm.
Which is another common misconception. Which is why this makes it feels so obvious now that we're talking about it, but I don't know why we didn't think of it earlier.
I think that more people die in hyperthermia because there isn't things like right to shelter. So I think potentially we would have higher mortality rates if we didn't have right to shelter during hypothermia season. So, it just means the right to shelter does save lives.
Yeah, it
Great,
does.
that could be yes.
And I think it just makes a lot of sense. I think I just want to affirm it fitting, like you're saying, we didn't think of this earlier, probably because there was this existing winter mindset, but I really appreciate the leadership that looks at gaps, right? And not reduplicating services, but listening and seeing those gaps. And this feels like one of them. And I appreciate your transparency and the like foresight as well to say like, we don't know the next year's going to be better. And so thinking about that, I also just want to affirm what I think I hear John and Ray saying a little bit, which is like, you as a staff have a clear insight about that, and you could put together a plan which could say this would be the best thing, and then we can see. But I also want us as a board, and maybe this is an aspirational thing for me leadership wise as a group that has a lot of power as representing all these different constituencies in Georgetown, that we could, if that's the need, then we don't have to be like shy about saying, let's step up and meet the need, and going back to our respective constituencies and saying, if we believe it to be so, and if we as a team think so, then saying like, now, like, this is the right thing to do. And how can we meet it? I know that we can't spend all of our kind of energy in one area, so we have to be wise about that, and your staff too, but All right, I'll get off my pulpit or soapbox. Yeah.
I'm happily sitting in the choir, Brett. That's great.
Okay.
Well, no, but I heard the comment earlier that if we get it started, then we have to stop. We end up potentially alienating some of the very people
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
we're trying to serve. So, I just have some sensitivity to that.
Absolutely.
But it also raises the question in my mind, if we have that sensitivity and we want to start in April, it's like, I guess that's for the smaller group. Are you really thinking from April all the way through the winter? If to go along with your statement about you would irritate somebody if you have it and then you don't.
Well,
So
so I think the idea is that we're offsetting the fact. So anyone who wants shelter from November basically through, usually it's supposed to be the 1st of April, but because there are usually some typical freeze dates and because of the way that they shut down the hypothermia shelter programs, it's usually around mid-April that they're closed and they're back to their standard operating capacity and not the expanded capacity that they do for hypothermia season. So if we were to run, instead of running our program, because that's what our program used to be for our winter shelter program, was November through April. Instead of running that half of the year, we run the inverse half of the year, April through October. That then creates an opportunity for shelter for our guests who would not otherwise have access to shelter, because it may not be through us, but we can say, starting November 1st, yep, our program is shutting down, but you now have access to these citywide services until April. And then, and that's going back and forth between those. Does that make sense?
it does.
So it's running half of the year like we did before, but it's just the inverse half of the year. Great. I don't know if there's other, I think at this point, obviously there are still a lot of variables. So I'm really glad we had this conversation here at the program committee meeting. There's still a lot to be done before we officially present this, as we're still hammering it out. But I'm glad to hear the discussion and that the values are shared there around meeting this need and the gap in services, and we'll just figure out what we can do, if anything, this year. And it might be something that we strategically look for to next year. I yelled at DHS this past year because they came to me in September to plan for hypothermia shelter starting in November, and that wasn't enough time. And so I'm gonna maybe yell at myself for saying we're planning summer shelter when it's already started, and trying to figure that out. So how problematic that could be.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Well, it sounds like it'll be a continuing conversation then. We put out feelers to a few other congregations we may hear back from. I think it's also just good education. Every one of these conversations that I've had has also, just as we just did tonight, like, it helps us learn about the need and the availability of access in our city. So those are good conversations to have, even with your friends. Hey, did you know that people, in the winter, you can call 311 and get the hypothermia van to come around, but not in the summer. So I guess what's next on our agenda then is the Juneteenth. Well, I just want to clarify, so we are clear where we're leaving this. Is this going to be on the agenda then for the board meeting? Are we going to see how it goes between now and then?
I think we'll see how it goes between now and then, depending upon what kind of progress and what we're able to gather.
Okay.
We'll make a determination if we're going to the full board, unless this group here right now definitely wants us to bring it to the full board.
Well, I still think you guys, you and the staff is just gonna make sure it makes sense, and I think.
Yeah. That's,
I
yeah.
agree.
I think
Yeah.
I'm comfortable from the program committee stance that if Kelly and Rebecca come up with a plan that they're comfortable with, I think I'm happy taking the board and advocating for it, that this is a worthy program that we should be considering funding. But I don't want to force something if you guys don't think it's ready.
Okay.
And it could just be then we just pivot and say this would be a conversation for next April. So we all have time to strategize, work with your organizations and congregations, get sound messaging and really come out strong in April. So that could be the other pivot.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, sounds good. So we'll keep communicating and see how this conversation evolves over the weeks.
Perfect.
So next on our agenda is just a reminder, I guess, heads up about the service day on Juneteenth. We are having 3-4 volunteer locations at the center, which I think there were, when Teddy sent out an email this morning, there were still a few volunteer spots available at the GMC main center. Then here at GLC, Georgetown Lutheran, the pop-up is not open on holidays typically, so we're able to use this space for burrito making. We're making breakfast burritos, and it's also a place I just want to highlight, especially for people who will be out of town, or maybe you have people in your congregation or otherwise who would like to donate or start a drive. You could even do it on social media here in the next couple of weeks. You could, if items to be donated can be shipped directly through the Amazon list, or they could be brought to Georgetown Lutheran on Juneteenth. And then the other volunteer opportunity is at Mount Zion Cemetery. Yeah, and so there's a centralized volunteer sign up and information page, which has gone around, and I will drop it in the chat again. So what else should we add? Kelly, Rebecca, anybody, questions?
I think you got it.
All right. Oops, I commented that not to the group chat. Hold on. There we go.
That was good. That was
Okay.
a good.
That's the thing. Okay. Sounds good. That's next Wednesday.
Mhm.
And what else for the good of the order? Anybody have questions, comments, ideas, input? Kelly?
Do you think, so I know we were talking about advocacy. Do you think it is worthwhile to to make a recommendation to spin out, like I know like other organizations have entire committees designated to that. Is that something that we should be considering?
I mean, yeah, this is the first that we're talking about this, but
Yes,
I think it would be I personally think it would be a good thing to separate and explore or make a subcommittee or some effort. I want to applaud how you as a staff have been sharing, stepping up and being present along with your other sister service providers in the city in some of the ways to, like with the Way Home Alliance Committee, program?
The Way Home Committee, campaign,
which is a united effort. Yeah, but I think a subcommittee or committee would be good. What do y'all think?
I think it's an interesting idea. I'm hoping we get enough interest from our board members to want to staff it. We've got a challenge sometimes filling our committees, but if this is something that sparks an interest, I think it's a very worthy kind of cause that I think can help in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I would agree, and especially since I guess I don't know this. Maybe the executive committee would know, or governance committee. I would be surprised if every board member was active in the committee. So could we? It seems like we should be able to populate an advocacy committee.
Everyone is assigned a committee, but attendance levels vary. So Athena asked if it would compromise any of our existing funding, because it's advocacy is like on an educational level, as long as we are not like directly lobbying for funding to Georgetown Ministry Center, and we are not expending like 10% of ours directly on lobbying. And that's not, and that's for our benefit, not because at this point in time, we have basically zero government dollars. There are not, we can't use, there's some of our foundation funding, like says we can't use that money to lobby, but there's a difference between lobby and advocacy where it's more educational. And so we are not anywhere close to that, if even in any way at this point in time. And especially if we're building it out from a board capacity standpoint, that wouldn't jeopardize anything. It's about what you spend money on specifically.
That's a helpful question. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's good. It is a very good question. Because there are rules.
Anything else? Okay, well, given that we are about at the hour,
I was gonna say, right on time.
right on time, but I think that rather than trying to thread the needle of schedules right now, especially because we're missing some usually active members of the committee, I will prepare and send out a doodle poll tomorrow morning with some proposed dates. We've typically fallen on the first or second Monday to be off cycle with the regular board meetings, but so I'll look at some of those and send it out in the morning. We've covered a lot of good ground. I appreciate everybody's attention to these matters. I'm going to kind of highlight for the email wrap up to those who weren't here that like, hey, we discussed some important stuff, so you might want to go read these notes. And if you have further comments or want to talk about things, yeah, in the in-between time, and we'll probably hear more about these possibilities before the next board meeting. So, yep. All right, thanks for everybody's time. I will also share this recording. So, yep.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night, y'all.
Thank you.
Good.